Hello and welcome to another episode of these Python tutorials I'm making. In this episode we're going to go over functions. And what a function is instead of writing like 20 lines to do something in your code base again and again and again and just repeating yourself, you could just write a function and run that in a single line. So let's say you have two values and you want to add them together. You have x, which is 10, x, which is 10, and y, which is 20. Let's say you can't just x plus y. You can't just do that. Let's say you need a function to do it. What you could do is you could write def, which means define function, and add. This is the name of the function. This is telling Python that you're making a function. This is the name of the function. And within these brackets here, you give the function its parameters. Now these parameters are going to be internal variables into the function. These can be named whatever you want. So I'm going to write n and I. I just like to have simple names in these tutorials, but in real projects, it's good to have descriptive names. So I'm just gonna call them num1 and num2 for number 1 and number 2. Now what I can do in this function is I can write num1 plus num2. Yes, I can just return num1 plus num2. And what this will happen now if I want to store the value of this function with these two parameters in a variable, I could write added equals add with x and y, telling it that num1 is x and num2 is y. And if I now print out the added, if I now print out added, you can see it'll print out 30. If I now tell this function to print out I could also tell this function to print out the variables before I see them. So it'll print number 1 is and num1 and number 2 is num2, and it'll return num1 plus num2. So what will happen now is Python says, I say to Python x is 10, y is 20 in the add function. It'll print out number 1 is num1 and number 2 is num2, and then it'll return num1 and num2. This return statement is basically what tells Python. It basically says that this function returns these values, and I can store the result of this function in a variable, which I call added. And then I'll print out added. So as you can see, number 1 is 1, number 1 is 10, number 2 is 20, and those added together is 30. The variable of added is 30. Now it is important that you write add, because if I just run this now, it'll do nothing, because I have the variables and I have the function, but I never tell Python that I want to run the function. So this does nothing. If I now just do add and I write x and y, it'll just add x and y without storing them into a variable. You could also do that. You could also make a function that doesn't take any parameters. So let's say I have a function that's 1 plus 1. I'll just call it 1 underline 1. And this function doesn't take any parameters. By the way, your names after each function needs to be text. It can't be numbers. Sorry, I'll name this function 1 plus 1. And what this function will do, it'll return 1 plus 1. So now I can store x equals 1 plus 1, and I can print out x. And now what'll happen is I tell Python how this function works, and I tell Python that I want to store the value of this function in x, and I want to print out x. And now x prints out 2.